She held my hand before she even knew my name, and I let her. The needle went in. She never once let go of me. 3 months later, everything I believed about myself quietly changed forever. My mother said she'd rather I stayed silent than admit the truth. I almost lost her twice, once to fear, once to a stranger's mistake. The last time I saw her, I was running toward a hospital, a vote, a scar, a secret, all traced back to one blood drive. What happened next depends entirely on which of us you believe. My name is Dana Whitfield, and I grew up in Lansdale, Pennsylvania, believing certain feelings were sins meant to be buried deep and never mentioned. I was 29 years old, teaching 3rd grade at a small public school, when a routine Red Cross blood drive changed the direction of my entire life. The gymnasium at Lansdale Community Center smelled like rubbing alcohol and stale coffee when I walked in that gray Saturday morning, dreading every step. I hated needles more than almost anything, so I dragged my coworker Renee along for moral support, gripping her sleeve like a nervous child. Renee got called back first, leaving me alone on a folding cot beside a stranger who was calmly settling into the chair next to mine. "First time?" she asked, and I nodded, unable to look away from her steady, unbothered green eyes for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Her name was Josie Calloway, a paramedic from 2 towns over, spending her one day off donating blood instead of resting at home. When the technician finally found my vein, my whole body tensed, and without even asking, Josie reached over and took my hand firmly. She didn't let go until the bag was full, talking softly about anything at all except the needle sitting deep in my arm. Afterward, she handed me apple juice and a lopsided cookie like it was the most natural, unremarkable thing in the entire world. "You did great," she said, and something in her tone made my chest ache in a way I hadn't felt in years. I gave her my number before I could think better of it, telling myself firmly it was only about making a new friend. Renee returned just as Josie walked away, raising an eyebrow at me like she'd witnessed something I hadn't fully noticed myself yet. "That woman held your hand the entire time," Renee said, and I shrugged like it hadn't meant anything at all to me. Josie texted me that same night, asking if the cookie had made up for the bruise already blooming on my arm. We fell into an easy rhythm of messages, and within 2 weeks we were talking every single night until well past midnight. She invited me to a small diner outside of town, the kind with cracked red vinyl booths and bottomless coffee refills. I told myself firmly it was just 2 women becoming friends, even as my stomach flipped every single time she smiled at me. Josie talked about her job with a passion I quietly envied, saving lives while I worried about spelling tests and glue sticks. She asked careful, patient questions about my life, and I noticed she never once assumed I had a boyfriend waiting at home. One night she mentioned an ex-girlfriend so casually that I nearly choked on my coffee, stunned by the sudden wave of relief. I realized much later that the relief wasn't about her being single at all, it was about her being like me, quietly. I had never once said the word lesbian about myself out loud, not even in the privacy of my own bedroom. Growing up, my mother called certain women confused, in a tone sharp enough to end any further conversation at our dinner table. I buried whatever I'd felt for girls back in high school so deep that I convinced myself I had simply imagined it. But sitting across from Josie, watching her laugh with her whole face, nothing about what I felt seemed imagined or invented anymore. She caught me staring once and just smiled instead of looking away, like she already understood something I hadn't dared to say. "You can tell me anything," she said quietly one evening, and I believed her more than I'd believed anyone in years. We started meeting twice a week, then 3 times, our easy friendship stretching slowly into something neither of us had named yet. Renee noticed first, teasing me relentlessly about the new spring in my step every single Monday morning before class started. I brushed her off with a laugh, but at home alone, I found myself rereading Josie's old texts like they were love letters. Josie invited me over to her apartment for dinner, and I spent an embarrassing hour deciding what a friend would reasonably wear. Her apartment was small and warm, full of framed hiking photographs and a scruffy orange cat named Biscuit who adored her completely. We cooked together, bumping elbows at the stove, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of the silence stretching between us. After dinner she put on quiet music, and when a slow song started, she simply held out her open hand toward me. We swayed together in her tiny kitchen, and I felt something finally settle inside me that had been restless for 29 years. "I like you, Dana," she said softly against my hair. "And I think you might like me too, if you'd let yourself admit it." I couldn't answer her with words, so I answered instead by not stepping away, by staying exactly where I already was. That night I drove home crying, not from sadness at all but from the terrifying relief of finally being truly, fully seen. I didn't sleep a single hour, replaying the warmth of her hand until the sun came up over my quiet apartment window. The next morning I texted her one single word, "Yet," and she called me before I'd even set the phone back down. We agreed to take things slowly, careful with a truth that neither of us had said out loud to anyone else yet. Our first real kiss happened in her car outside a movie theater, quick and startled, like we'd both been struck by lightning. I laughed afterward, giddy and terrified all at once, and Josie just grinned and said, "There. Now it's finally real, Dana." For the first time in my entire life, I understood exactly what people meant when they described love as coming home. We started spending most weekends together, hiking trails outside Lansdale where no one from my school was ever likely to recognize us. Josie never once pushed me to tell anyone, but I could see the quiet, patient hope in her eyes whenever I hesitated too long. I told Renee first, my hands shaking so badly that I spilled coffee clear across her small, cluttered kitchen table. Renee just hugged me tightly and said, "Finally. I've been waiting for you to catch up to yourself for actual months now." Having even one person know felt like taking off a heavy coat I'd worn far too long into the middle of summer. Josie met Renee for lunch one afternoon, and I watched them get along like old friends, and something in me finally eased. My parents lived only 40 minutes away, but the distance between us felt like it was quietly growing wider by the day. I started rehearsing conversations with my mother in the shower every morning, none of which ever ended the way I secretly hoped. Josie asked, gently but directly, if I planned to ever tell my family, and I changed the subject 3 separate times before answering. "When I'm ready," I finally said, and she nodded, though I saw something flicker behind her patient, watchful eyes just then. For a few quiet months, we lived inside a small bubble of hiking trails, dinners, and secrets that felt sweet instead of heavy. I started keeping a small notebook of moments with her, afraid that if I didn't write them down, I might one day doubt they happened. Josie called me brave once, and I laughed bitterly, because hiding felt like the opposite of bravery no matter how she framed it. Some nights we talked about the future in careful, hypothetical terms, testing the shape of a life neither of us had said out loud yet. Josie kept a spare toothbrush at my place before I ever officially asked her to, and I never once mentioned moving it back to hers. I started noticing small things, the way she hummed while driving, the way she always let strangers merge first, and I loved every piece of it. For my birthday, she made me a playlist instead of buying a gift, saying music said things she still wasn't sure how to say herself. The bubble finally broke on a Sunday when my mother called, asking pointedly why I'd missed church 3 weeks in a row. I mumbled excuses about grading papers, but she said my cousin had seen my car parked outside Josie's building overnight. Twice now. My stomach dropped instantly, and I realized Lansdale was far smaller than I'd ever allowed myself to fully, honestly believe. "Is there something you need to tell me, Dana?" my mother asked, her voice suddenly sharp with unmistakable, familiar suspicion. I panicked and said Josie was just a friend going through a hard time, hating myself for the lie the moment I said it. That night I told Josie exactly what happened, and she went quiet in a way that scared me more than anger ever would have. "How long are we going to be a secret?" she asked flatly. and I had no honest answer to give her in return. My father had always been softer than my mother, but even he changed the channel whenever anything about gay rights came on television. I remembered a distant cousin, Wes, who always left family gatherings early and was never once spoken of by name afterward. No one ever explained why Wes had stopped coming around, but the silence around him taught me exactly what to expect for myself. Josie pulled back slightly after that phone call, showing up late to dinners and texting far less than she normally used to. I told myself she was simply busy with work, even as a colder distance crept steadily between us like changing weather outside. The school. A parent complained after seeing me at a coffee shop with Josie, saying I had looked too close to another woman. My principal, Mr. Halloran, called me into his office and asked carefully worded questions about my so-called personal associations outside of school. I left that meeting shaking badly, aware for the very first time that my job could genuinely be at risk over who I loved. Josie noticed the fear in my voice the moment I told her, and instead of comforting me, she simply looked exhausted and worn down. "This is what it's like for me every single day," she said sharply. "I need you to understand that this isn't new for me." I realized slowly that I had been treating her caution as overreaction, when really she had been protecting the both of us all along. We had our first real fight that night, voices rising steadily over what safety and honesty should actually look like between two people. She left my apartment without even finishing her coffee, and I sat alone afterward wondering if I had already ruined everything good. Renee reminded me firmly that fear doesn't excuse cowardice, and that Josie deserved far more than my constant, exhausting hesitation. I called my mother again the following weekend, deciding I would carefully test the waters before saying anything definite or final. I mentioned a coworker who had recently come out, watching my mother's face twist slowly into something that looked like quiet disgust. "That family must be devastated," she said flatly, and I felt whatever courage I'd built crumble instantly inside my chest. I hung up the phone and cried harder than I had in years, feeling smaller than I had since I was a child. Josie found me like that later, and instead of saying, "I told you so," she simply held me close without saying a single word. "You don't owe her your whole self if she can't handle it," Josie whispered, and I clung tightly to that sentence for weeks afterward. Things between us slowly repaired themselves, but a new caution had settled in, like a bruise that hadn't fully healed just yet. My father unexpectedly called one quiet evening, his voice softer than usual, simply asking if I was doing okay lately. Something in his tone made me wonder, for the very first time, if he suspected far more than my mother ever actually did. I didn't tell him anything that particular night, but I hung up feeling like a door had opened just slightly for me. The school. The whispers grew steadily louder, and one morning I found an anonymous note in my mailbox calling me a bad influence. I didn't tell Josie about the note right away, not wanting to give her one more reason to think I should keep hiding us. But Renee found it first on my desk, and she marched straight to the principal's office before I could even stop her. Mr. Halloran promised a formal investigation, though his tight, careful expression told me he wasn't entirely on my side about any of it. Josie found out anyway, through a mutual friend, and her face went completely pale when she finally saw the note for herself. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said quietly, "and I still don't think you're ready for what might come next." Her words felt like an accusation at first, though I understood later she was voicing her own fear, not doubting my love for her. We argued again, this time about whether love was even enough to survive a world that punished people like us simply for existing. She left abruptly for a work shift without resolving anything between us, and I spent that whole night staring at my ceiling, wide awake. 2 long days later, Josie still hadn't answered any of my texts, and worry crept in steadily alongside the growing silence. I remembered, suddenly, that Wes had once tried calling my mother during a family emergency years ago, and had been sent straight to voicemail. I wondered, sitting there afraid, whether I was watching my own future unfold. Another name quietly erased from every future holiday gathering. On the third day, her sister called me instead of Josie herself, her voice trembling as she said, "There's been an accident." My hands went completely numb around the phone as Josie's sister, Marcy, explained that an ambulance call had gone badly wrong on the highway. A drunk driver had hit the rig Josie was riding in, and she'd been rushed straight into surgery for serious internal bleeding. I drove to the hospital faster than I ever should have, barely remembering the roads, my mind blank except for her name. In the crowded waiting room, Marcy told me Josie needed blood urgently, a rare type the hospital's supply was dangerously low on that night. I remembered, almost absurdly, the blood drive where we'd first met, and I asked a nurse to test my blood type immediately. By some strange mercy, I matched perfectly, and within the hour I was lying in a donation chair again, this time entirely for her. The nurse held my hand exactly the way Josie once had, and I understood that the symmetry wasn't lost on anyone in that room. Hours passed with no updates at all, and Marcy and I sat together, strangers suddenly bound by fear for the very same woman. "She talks about you all the time," Marcy admitted quietly. "I didn't know how serious it was until I saw your face just now." I told her everything then. The blood drive, the kitchen dance, the fights, the silence. Unable to hold any of it back any longer, Marcy squeezed my hand tightly and said, "Whatever you two are to each other, don't waste time being scared of it. Life's too short." A surgeon finally emerged and said Josie was stable, though the next 24 hours would determine exactly how well she recovered from surgery. I called my mother without thinking twice, needing someone, anyone. And the words came tumbling out before I could stop myself completely. Josie was in an accident. I love her. Mom. I've loved her for months, and I'm terrified that I'm going to lose her. There was a long, heavy silence on the line, longer than any silence I had ever managed to survive in my entire life. "Where are you?" my mother finally asked, and I gave her the hospital's name, bracing myself for whatever might come next. She showed up 2 hours later, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the waiting room, clearly unsure of where to even put her hands. She didn't say she understood everything, but she sat down beside me quietly, and that was more than I had let myself hope for. When Josie was finally moved to a recovery room, I was allowed in first, and I held her hand the way she'd once held mine. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused at first, then found my face and softened gradually into something like quiet, exhausted relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse, and I told her firmly I would always come, no matter what stood between us. My mother watched silently from the doorway, and I saw something subtle shift in her expression, though I couldn't yet name exactly what it was. Over the following days, my mother visited the hospital more than once, bringing coffee for me and small, careful talk for Marcy. She never once mentioned love or labels directly, but she started asking about Josie's recovery like she genuinely mattered, and that felt like real progress. Meanwhile, word of the accident spread quickly through Lansdale, and with it came pointed questions about why I'd been the one giving blood. My principal called a few days later, his tone stiff, saying the school board wanted to discuss recent rumors. Once the semester finally ended, I realized then that the anonymous note, the whispers, and now this were all building steadily toward a confrontation I could no longer avoid. Josie, still weak from surgery, told me firmly that she didn't want me fighting her battles while quietly continuing to ignore my own. "You have to stop hiding for my sake," she said. "I'd rather lose my job than watch you disappear a little more every single day." Her words settled into me very differently than my mother's silence ever had, clear and unafraid, exactly like the woman I had fallen for. I visited my father alone one quiet evening, finally telling him absolutely everything without softening a single detail of the story. He listened patiently, then quietly admitted his own brother, my uncle, had left the family decades earlier for reasons no one ever discussed. I always wondered if we drove him away, my father said softly. And I really don't want to make that same mistake twice. That small confession cracked something open in me, revealing a whole family history of silence I had never fully understood until that night. My mother, turned out, had grown up believing love like mine was dangerous, taught carefully by her own mother's harsh judgment years earlier. She wasn't cruel because she didn't love me at all. She was afraid, simply repeating patterns she had never once questioned until forced to. Slowly, over several weeks, she began asking Josie real, genuine questions about her job, her family, and what made her laugh so easily. It wasn't a movie moment of instant, sweeping acceptance, but a series of small, imperfect steps towards something noticeably better between all of us. Meanwhile, the school board formally scheduled a meeting, and persistent rumors suggested they were seriously considering my dismissal over vague conduct concerns. Renee quietly organized a handful of co-workers and parents willing to speak on my behalf, far more allies than I had ever realized I had. Josie, still healing slowly, insisted on attending the meeting with me anyway, refusing to let me face it entirely without her beside me. The night before the hearing, I barely slept at all, quietly rehearsing what I would say if given any real chance to speak. Josie's doctor had warned her firmly against too much stress, but she waved off the warning, saying, "I've survived worse than a school board." I found Wes's old number in an ancient family address book and, for the first time in a decade, actually dialed it before I could stop myself. He answered on the third ring, startled to hear my voice, and when I explained why I'd called, he went quiet for a long moment. "Nobody in this family ever calls unless something's wrong," he said softly. "So tell me everything. And don't leave out the hard parts." Talking to Wes felt like finding a map someone had hidden from me my entire life, proof that survival on the other side was possible. The school boardroom was packed far tighter than I expected, chairs scraping loudly against linoleum as parents and staff quickly filed in. Mr. Halloran opened the meeting by citing vague community concerns, without ever once using the actual words that everyone in the room understood he meant. When it was finally my turn to speak, my voice shook badly, but I made myself stand up and look directly at the board. "I am a good teacher," I said clearly. "That has never once changed, no matter who I happen to love outside these walls." I told them about Josie, about the accident, about giving blood for the woman who had once held my hand through pure fear. I said plainly that I was done apologizing for feelings that had never once hurt a single child inside my classroom. A low murmur spread through the crowded room, some faces tightening with disapproval, others softening in ways I honestly hadn't expected to see at all. Renee stood up next, describing years of watching me put my students first, long before anyone at all knew about my personal life. Then, unexpectedly, my mother rose slowly from her seat in the back row, asking quietly to be heard as a parent, not a board member. My heart stopped completely as she walked to the front, and I had no idea whether she'd come to defend me or condemn me. "My daughter almost lost the person she loves," she said clearly. "And I almost lost my daughter by staying silent for far too long." She said she didn't fully understand everything, but she understood love. And she understood watching someone slowly shrink themselves just to survive. The room went completely quiet, and I felt tears sting my eyes. Not from fear this time, but from pure disbelief instead. One board member, an older man named Elton Briggs, asked bluntly whether my lifestyle would ever be discussed openly with the students. I answered honestly that I kept my personal life entirely private, exactly as every other teacher, married or single, was already allowed to. Josie, sitting beside me despite her doctor's explicit warnings about overexertion, squeezed my hand firmly under the table the entire time. After nearly 2 long hours of debate, the board announced they would finally vote, and the room fell into tense, suffocating silence. Before the vote, Elton Briggs unexpectedly asked for a short recess, his hands trembling slightly as he quietly stepped out of the room. When he returned, he said quietly that his own son had come out to him 2 years earlier, and that he had handled it badly. "I don't want to make that same mistake again. In public. In front of a room full of people," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. The vote finally came back 4-1. Firmly in favor of taking no disciplinary action against me whatsoever that day. Relief hit me so hard that I nearly collapsed straight into my chair, Josie catching my arm quickly to steady me in time. Outside the building, my mother hugged me tightly for the first time in months, her grip somehow tighter than I remembered it ever being. "I still have a lot to learn," she admitted quietly, "but I don't want to lose any more time not truly knowing you." That night, Josie and I sat together on her porch, exhausted but somehow lighter than we had felt in what seemed like years. "I told you I'd always come," I said softly, echoing her own words back to her from that hospital room days earlier. She laughed softly and said, "I think I finally believe you," resting her head gently against my shoulder in the warm porch light. The following weeks brought quiet, steady changes. My father asking Josie about her hiking trips. My mother slowly learning her coffee order by heart. Not everyone in Lansdale came around eventually. A few parents transferred their kids elsewhere, and one neighbor stopped waving at me entirely after that. But for every door that quietly closed, another opened instead, including an invitation from a teacher 2 towns over to speak at her school. Marcy became a regular, welcome presence in our lives. Teasing Josie for getting hit by a truck just to get me a hospital reunion. Josie recovered fully over time, though she carried a faint scar along her ribs that she jokingly called her reminder to slow down. Elton Briggs sent me a short handwritten note weeks later, thanking me quietly for reminding him what his own son had needed to hear. On the 1-year anniversary of the blood drive, I organized a small drive of our own right outside the community center. Josie sat beside me again in the donation chair, holding my hand exactly the way she had that very first nervous time. When the needle went in that day, I didn't flinch at all, because I finally understood what her steady hand had meant all along. I invited Wes to that second blood drive, unsure if he'd come, and when his truck pulled into the lot, I nearly cried in the parking lot. He hugged my mother first, awkward and brief, and she let him, which told me more about how far she'd come than any words could have. "I should have called you years ago," she told him quietly, and he said simply, "You're calling now." That's what matters to me. Watching the two of them talk, careful and unhurried, I understood that healing in families rarely arrives all at once, but in small, deliberate steps. Renee brought her own girlfriend to the drive that year, someone I hadn't even known existed, and we laughed about how much we'd all been hiding. Josie proposed that autumn, kneeling awkwardly in her kitchen where we'd first danced, saying she wanted every future blood drive to start with my hand in hers. My mother came to that second blood drive too, standing quietly by the sign-up table, slowly learning to show love in small, steady ways. I used to think love had to stay hidden to be safe, but Josie taught me it only becomes real once it's finally seen. Fendi.